The gunshot echoed across the empty plains as Mabel Peterson ran, clutching her 6-month-old son to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fled the town that had been her home for the past year. Behind her, angry voices faded into the wind, but their cruel words remained etched in her mind. It was 1875 in the harsh territory of Montana, and Mabel had never felt more alone. Her baby boy, Elijah, whimpered against her, his tiny body burning with fever. The townsfolk had declared him cursed, blamed him for the drought that had scorched their lands, and demanded they leave or face consequences far worse than exile. "Hush now, little one," she whispered, her cracked lips brushing against his forehead. "Mama's got you. We'll find somewhere safe." But as the sun began its descent behind the rugged mountains, Mabel's strength wavered. Her worn boots stumbled over the uneven ground, and the meager supplies she'd managed to grab weighed heavily on her shoulders. Elijah's coughing had worsened, his small chest heaving with each labored breath. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose above the trees. A campfire. Mabel hesitated, fear gripping her heart. Strangers in these parts could mean salvation or doom. With Elijah growing worse by the hour, she had little choice. She approached cautiously, staying hidden among the trees until she could make out a solitary figure tending to a modest fire. A man in worn riding clothes sat with his back to her, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the flames. A cowboy's hat rested beside him, and a horse grazed nearby. Mabel stepped on a twig, the snap loud in the evening quiet. The man spun around, his hand moving to the gun at his hip with practiced speed. "Who's there?" His voice was deep, commanding but not threatening. Mabel stepped forward, her arms tightening protectively around Elijah. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "My baby is sick. We need help." The man stood slowly, revealing his full height. His face, partially illuminated by the firelight, showed a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, keen and alert, moved from Mabel to the bundle in her arms. "Come into the light," he said, his hand moving away from his weapon. Mabel approached tentatively. As she stepped into the circle of firelight, the man's expression changed from wariness to concern. He saw her, then truly saw her, a young woman hardly older than 20, exhausted and frightened, holding a clearly ill child. "My name is Quentin Yates," he said, his tone softening. "What brings you out here alone with a little one?" "They drove us out," Mabel whispered, swaying slightly as exhaustion threatened to overcome her. "Said my boy was cursed, that he brought the drought. He's been sick and they wouldn't help us." Elijah chose that moment to let out a pitiful wail, his small body racked with coughing. Without hesitation, Quentin stepped forward, reaching for the child. "May I?" he asked, his hands steady and sure. Something in his eyes, a kindness Mabel hadn't seen in months, made her nod. She carefully transferred Elijah to the stranger's arms. Quentin cradled the infant with surprising gentleness for a man of his stature. He examined the baby's flushed face, felt his forehead, and listened to his labored breathing. His expression remained calm, but his eyes reflected deep concern. "He's burning up," Quentin said. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days now," Mabel replied, her voice catching. "It started with just a cough, but then the fever came, and the town doctor refused to see him after the preacher said." She couldn't finish the sentence. Quentin's jaw tightened. "Superstitious fools," he muttered. He looked down at the infant, who had quieted somewhat in his arms, then back at Mabel. "I'm no doctor, madam, but I've seen this before. My sister's boy had similar symptoms last winter. We need to get this fever down." He guided Mabel to sit by the fire and handed Elijah back to her. "Rest here. I've got some herbs in my saddlebag that might help." As Quentin moved to his horse, Mabel studied him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of the frontier. His clothes were worn but clean, and despite his rough appearance, there was something trustworthy about him. He returned with a small leather pouch and a canteen. This is yarrow and willow bark, he explained, pulling out dried plants. My grandmother was part Cherokee. She taught me which plants heal. He set about preparing a mild tea, adding honey from a small jar to make it palatable. Why would you help us? Mabel asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. You don't know us. Quentin's hands paused in their work. His eyes, a deep brown that reflected the firelight, met hers. Madam, out here, refusing help is as good as murder. I don't need to know you to know that a child deserves care. Once the tea had cooled, Quentin showed Mabel how to administer small amounts to Elijah. The baby fussed, but managed to take some of the liquid. We'll need to keep him cool, Quentin said. He removed his bandana, soaked it in water from his canteen, and gently placed it on Elijah's forehead. The baby whimpered but seemed to relax slightly at the cool touch. As night fully descended, Quentin built up the fire and unrolled his bedroll for Mabel and Elijah. You take this, he insisted. I'll keep watch. Too exhausted to argue, Mabel lay down with Elijah cradled against her. She watched as Quentin settled himself against his saddle, rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Thank you, she whispered. Quentin nodded, his expression solemn. Get some rest, Miss Peterson, she supplied. Mabel Peterson. Miss Peterson, we'll see to your boy come morning. Throughout the night, Quentin regularly checked on Elijah, replacing the cool cloth on his forehead and helping Mabel administer more of the herbal tea. By dawn, the baby's fever seemed to have abated slightly. Mabel awoke to find Quentin cooking something over the fire. The smell of coffee and bacon made her stomach growl, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since fleeing town. How's the little one? Quentin asked, noticing she was awake. Mabel checked Elijah, relief washing over her as she felt his cooler skin. The fever's down, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. He's sleeping peacefully. Quentin nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Good, he's fighting. That's a strong boy you've got there. He handed her a tin cup of coffee and a plate with bacon and hardtack. Mabel accepted it gratefully, balancing Elijah in one arm as she ate. Where were you headed? Quentin asked as they ate. Mabel stared into her coffee. I don't know, she admitted. I just ran. My husband died in a mining accident 6 months ago, just before Elijah was born. I was working at the boarding house in Silver Creek, but then... She trailed off, the memories of the accusations still raw. Quentin's expression darkened. Silver Creek, you say? I've heard tell of that place. The preacher there, Reverend Wade, has a reputation for finding sin wherever it suits him. Mabel nodded, a bitter smile touching her lips. He said Elijah was born of sin because Thomas died before we could have a proper church wedding. Said that's why the drought came. Quentin's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Some men use God's name to cover their own cruelty, he said quietly. After a moment, he continued, I'm headed to Willow Springs. It's about 3 days' ride from here. There's a doctor there, a good man who won't turn away a child in need. Hope fluttered in Mabel's chest. Would you? Could we accompany you that far? Quentin studied her for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to Elijah, who was beginning to stir. The baby opened his eyes, revealing their unusual color, one blue, one green. Quentin's expression softened as the infant blinked up at him. Those are special eyes, he commented. Is that why they called him cursed? Mabel nodded. That and the birthmark on his shoulder. The Reverend said they were the devil's marks. Quentin reached out, letting Elijah grasp his finger with a tiny hand. The only mark I see is that of a fighter, he said firmly. Then, making a decision, he looked back at Mabel. You and your boy can ride with me to Willow Springs. I won't leave you out here alone. Relief flooded through Mabel. I can pay you once we reach town. I have some money saved. Quentin held up a hand. No need for that. Just help me break camp and we'll be on our way. Within the hour, they had packed up Quentin's modest camp. He helped Mabel onto his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Scout, before mounting behind her. Elijah was secured in a makeshift sling across Mabel's chest, fashioned from Quentin's spare shirt. As they rode, Mabel learned that Quentin was a former cavalry scout who now worked as a guide and occasionally delivered mail to remote settlements. He spoke little of his past, but his knowledge of the land was evident in how confidently he navigated the rugged terrain. By midday, they stopped to rest near a small creek. While Quentin tended to Scout, Mabel unwrapped Elijah to check his condition. The baby was more alert, though still weak, his unique eyes tracking movements with interest. "His breathing sounds better," Quentin observed, kneeling beside them. "But we should continue with the tea." As they prepared another batch of the herbal remedy, Mabel studied Quentin's hands, strong and calloused from years of hard work, yet surprisingly gentle as they crushed the dried leaves. "Where did you learn to care for children?" she asked. A shadow passed over Quentin's face. "My sister had 4 little ones. Her husband was killed in the war, so I helped when I could." He paused, focusing intently on his task. 3 of them died in a fever outbreak 2 years ago. Only the youngest survived. Mabel's heart ached at the pain evident in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Quentin nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "My sister couldn't bear to stay after that. She took my nephew and moved east to live with our aunt." He looked at Elijah, who was contentedly playing with a button on Mabel's dress. "Every child deserves a chance, Miss Peterson. Every single one." The conviction in his voice moved something deep within Mabel. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly seen not as a widow, not as a burden, but as a mother fighting for her child. They continued their journey through the afternoon. Quentin pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his travels, carefully avoiding mention of the war that had clearly shaped him. Mabel found herself relaxing against him, his solid presence a comfort after months of struggling alone. As dusk approached, they made camp in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods. Elijah's condition had improved enough that he was fussing for food, a good sign according to Quentin. "He's got an appetite," Quentin said approvingly as Mabel nursed the baby. He busied himself with the fire, giving her privacy. "That means he's fighting off whatever ails him." Later, as they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of beans and jerky, Quentin asked, "What will you do when we reach Willow Springs?" Mabel looked down at Elijah, now sleeping peacefully against her chest. "Find work, I suppose. I'm good with numbers. I kept the books at the boarding house. Or perhaps I could cook or clean for a family." Quentin nodded thoughtfully. "Willow Springs is growing. The railroad's planning to put a stop there next year. There should be opportunities." "And you?" Mabel asked. "What takes you there?" "I guide survey parties for the railroad sometimes," he explained. "There's a new job waiting for me, exploring a route through the mountains north of town." They fell into comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled between them. Mabel found herself studying Quentin's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. There was a steadiness to him that drew her, a quiet strength that reminded her of Thomas, yet was entirely his own. The second day of travel proved more challenging. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and by noon, rain began to fall. Quentin found shelter beneath an overhanging rock where they huddled together, watching the downpour. Elijah grew fussy in the confinement, his improved condition making him restless. Quentin surprised Mabel by asking to hold him. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms. Mabel hesitated only briefly before handing over her son. Quentin settled the baby against his broad chest, one large hand supporting Elijah's head. He began to hum a low melody, rocking slightly where he sat. Amazed, Mabel watched as Elijah quieted, his mismatched eyes fixed on Quentin's face with fascination. "You have a way with him," she observed. Quentin smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weather-worn face. "Babies are good judges of character," he said. "They know who they can trust." "And can I trust you, Mr. Yates?" The question slipped out before Mabel could stop it. Quentin's eyes met hers, serious and direct. "I make it a point never to give my word lightly, Miss Peterson." When I say I'll see you and your boy safely to Willow Springs, that's exactly what I mean. Mabel nodded, believing him despite the caution that had become second nature to her since Thomas's death. There was something undeniably honest about Quentin Yates. The rain continued through the afternoon, forcing them to spend the night beneath the rocky overhang. The close quarters meant they slept near one another, Elijah between them on the bedroll. Despite the uncomfortable conditions, Mabel slept better than she had in months, secure in the knowledge that Quentin was keeping watch. Dawn brought clear skies and renewed hope. Elijah woke cheerful and hungry, his fever completely gone though his cough lingered. Quentin examined him in the morning light, gently checking his chest and throat. "He's on the mend," he declared with satisfaction. "Still needs that doctor's looking at, but I'd wager the worst has passed." Relief washed over Mabel, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, wiping at her cheeks. "If you hadn't found us—" Quentin reached out, briefly touching her shoulder. "You found me, Miss Peterson. Remember that. You're stronger than you know." They rode through beautiful country that day, the recent rain having brought a verdant freshness to the landscape. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and birds called from the scattered trees. Quentin pointed out deer tracks and showed Mabel how to identify plants that could be eaten or used for medicine. By late afternoon, they crested a hill, and Quentin reined Scout to a halt. "There it is," he said, pointing to a valley below where a small town nestled against a backdrop of mountains. Willow Springs. Mabel took in the sight a cluster of wooden buildings along a main street, smoke rising from chimneys, a church steeple reaching skyward. It wasn't large, but it appeared welcoming after her ordeal. "We'll be there before sundown," Quentin said, urging Scout forward. As they approached town, Mabel grew increasingly aware of her appearance. Her dress was dirty and torn in places, her hair a tangled mess. What impression would she make on potential employers looking like a vagrant? Quentin seemed to sense her discomfort. "The doctor first," he said firmly. "Then we'll see about finding you proper lodging." They rode directly to a modest house at the edge of town with a small sign reading Dr. Franklin Wells, physician. Quentin helped Mabel dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment they stood close, Elijah between them, and something unspoken passed between them. The doctor, a kindly man with spectacles and graying hair, welcomed them without question. He examined Elijah thoroughly, listening to his chest and checking his throat. "Bronchial infection," he diagnosed. "You did well with the willow bark tea. I'll prepare a stronger tincture that should clear the rest of the congestion." He glanced curiously at Quentin. "You have some medical knowledge, sir." "Just what I've picked up along the way," Quentin replied modestly. Dr. Wells nodded approvingly. "Well, you likely saved this child's life. Another day or two without treatment and pneumonia would have set in." Mabel's heart clenched at how close she had come to losing Elijah. "What do I owe you, doctor?" she asked, reaching for her small purse. The doctor waved her off. "Consider it a welcome to Willow Springs. Just bring the boy back in a few days so I can check his progress." Outside, twilight was settling over the town. Quentin led them to the small hotel on the main street, where he secured a room for Mabel and Elijah. "What about you?" Mabel asked as they stood in the modest but clean room. "I'll find a place at the livery," he said. "Scout needs proper care after our journey." An awkward silence fell between them. After 3 days of constant companionship, the prospect of separation felt strangely difficult. "Will I see you tomorrow?" Mabel finally asked. Quentin nodded. "I'll help you get settled. Willow Springs is a good town, but it's still wise to have someone vouch for you." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, Quentin, for everything." His eyes softened at her use of his first name. "Get some rest, Mabel. You and Elijah are safe now." After he left, Mabel bathed herself and Elijah using the basin provided, then fell into the first real bed she'd slept in since fleeing Silver Creek. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she thought of Quentin, his kindness, his gentle strength, the way Elijah had taken to him so quickly. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt, but guilt quickly followed. Thomas had been gone barely a year. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man so soon? Morning brought a knock at her door. Quentin stood there, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt, his usual cowboy hat in hand. "I thought you might need these," he said, presenting a small bundle. Inside, Mabel found a simple dress, slightly worn but clean, and a small shirt and pants that would fit Elijah. "The general store owner's wife had them," Quentin explained, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "I mentioned your situation, and she was happy to help." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Mabel accepted the clothing. "You didn't have to do that." "Wanted to," he replied simply. "There's breakfast downstairs when you're ready." After changing, Mabel joined Quentin in the hotel's small dining room. Several patrons glanced curiously at them, but the atmosphere was far from hostile. A few women even smiled at Elijah, who was alert and animated in Mabel's arms. Over breakfast, Quentin outlined his plan. "The bank manager needs someone to help with accounts. His last clerk moved to Denver last month, and Mrs. Sullivan at the boarding house mentioned needing help with cooking and cleaning." Mabel stared at him in surprise. "You've been busy this morning." Quentin shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "Just asking around." By midday, Mabel had secured the position at the bank, starting the following week. Mr. Harrison, the manager, was impressed by her knowledge of bookkeeping and didn't seem to mind that she would need to bring Elijah with her. "My wife lost 2 babies before they were born," he confided quietly. "She has a soft spot for little ones. I'm sure she'll be by to fuss over him regularly." With employment secured, they visited Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house, where Mabel arranged for a small room at a reasonable rate. The motherly woman took an immediate liking to Elijah, cooing over his unique eyes. "That's a blessing, not a curse," she declared firmly when Mabel hesitantly explained why she had left Silver Creek. "My cousin has the same, and she's the luckiest person I know." As they walked back toward the hotel to collect Mabel's few belongings, Quentin grew uncharacteristically quiet. "Is something troubling you?" Mabel asked. He stopped, turning to face her. The main street bustled around them, but his focus was entirely on her. "I leave tomorrow," he said. "The survey party is waiting on me." Though Mabel had known this was coming, the news still fell heavily between them. "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks, perhaps a month." He hesitated, then continued, "I'd like to check on you and Elijah when I return, if that would be acceptable." Relief washed through her. "Of course, we'd like that very much." Quentin nodded, his expression lightening. "Good, that's good." That evening, he insisted on escorting them to the boarding house, carrying Mabel's small bag and the additional supplies he had purchased for her and Elijah. Mrs. Sullivan showed them to a modest but comfortable room at the back of the house, with a small window overlooking a garden. "It's perfect," Mabel said sincerely. After Mrs. Sullivan departed, Quentin lingered in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "I should go," he said reluctantly. Mabel stepped closer, Elijah content in her arms. "How can I ever repay you for what you've done for us?" Quentin's gaze was warm as it moved from her to Elijah. "Seeing this little fellow healthy is payment enough." He reached out, gently touching Elijah's cheek with one finger. The baby grasped it, holding tight with surprising strength. They both smiled at the gesture, but when Quentin looked up, his expression had grown serious. "Mabel, I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you can count on me." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "I believe you," she said softly. Quentin carefully extracted his finger from Elijah's grip. "I should let you settle in." He started to turn away, then paused. "Mabel? Yes, I'm glad you found my campfire that night." With that, he was gone, leaving Mabel standing in the doorway, her heart fluttering in a way it hadn't since before Thomas died. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity as Mabel established herself in Willow Springs. The townspeople proved welcoming, especially once they learned how she and Elijah had come to be there. Dr. Wells pronounced Elijah fully recovered, attributing his swift healing to both Quentin's early intervention and the child's natural resilience. Working at the bank proved satisfying, and Mr. Harrison was true to his word. His wife visited frequently, often bringing small gifts for Elijah and inviting Mabel to Sunday dinners. For the first time since Thomas's death, Mabel felt part of a community. Yet despite these blessings, she found herself watching the trail leading into town, hoping for a glimpse of a familiar buckskin horse and its rider. It was nearly a month before Quentin returned. Mabel was at the bank when Scout's distinctive trot caught her attention through the window. Her heart leaped at the sight of Quentin dismounting outside the general store, dusty from the trail but unmistakable. Mr. Harrison noticed her distraction. "Go on," he said with a knowing smile. "We're nearly closed anyway." Mabel gathered Elijah, who at 7 months was becoming more active by the day, and hurried outside. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if Quentin had simply been kind to a woman in distress? What if his promise to check on them had been merely politeness? Before she could retreat, Quentin emerged from the store and spotted her. His face broke into a wide smile that erased all her doubts. "Mabel," he said, crossing the street to reach her. His eyes moved to Elijah, who was regarding him with curious recognition. "And look at you, young man. Growing stronger every day, I see." "We've missed you," Mabel said simply. Something in Quentin's expression softened. "I've missed you both as well." He reached out, and Elijah immediately grasped his finger, just as he had the night Quentin left. "He remembers me." "Of course he does," Mabel replied. "He knows who helped save him." Quentin looked around at the busy street. "Could we speak somewhere more private?" They walked to the small park near the church, finding a bench beneath a large oak tree. Quentin seemed uncharacteristically nervous, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "How was your expedition?" Mabel asked, sensing he needed time to gather his thoughts. "Successful," he replied. "We found a pass that will save miles of track." He paused, then continued more hesitantly. "I've been offered a permanent position with the railroad. Supervisor of a construction crew. It would mean settling in one place for at least a year." Mabel's heart quickened. "Here in Willow Springs," Quentin nodded. "The pay is good, steady work." His eyes met hers. "I've been a wanderer most of my life, Mabel. Never saw much reason to put down roots. But lately, I've been thinking differently." Elijah chose that moment to babble excitedly, reaching toward Quentin. Without hesitation, Quentin took him, settling the baby comfortably in his arms. Elijah immediately began exploring his vest buttons with curious fingers. "He's gotten heavier," Quentin observed with a smile. "And louder," Mabel added. "Mrs. Sullivan says he has a future as a preacher with those lungs." They shared a laugh, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Quentin's expression grew serious again. "Mabel, I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband." "I wouldn't presume to," he stopped, gathering his thoughts. "What I mean to say is I care for you and Elijah, more than I expected to, more than might be proper to admit so soon." Mabel's heart pounded in her chest. "Quentin, you don't need to say anything," he hurried on. "I just wanted you to know that I took this job because of you, both of you, and if there comes a time when you might consider." He trailed off, looking down at Elijah, who was contentedly playing with his watch chain. Mabel reached out, placing her hand over his. "Thomas would have wanted Elijah and me to be happy," she said softly. "And you, Quentin Yates, make us happy." The hope that bloomed in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "Does that mean," "It means," Mabel said carefully, "that I would like for us to know each other better, properly. And see where that leads." Quentin's smile was like the sunrise. "I'd like that very much." As spring turned to summer, Quentin became a fixture in Mabel and Elijah's life. He took a room at Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house when not at the railroad camp and spent his free evenings with them. Sundays often found the three of them picnicking by the creek or visiting with the growing circle of friends Mabel had made in town. Elijah thrived, growing stronger each day. He took his first steps, holding Quentin's fingers, a moment that brought unexpected tears to the cowboy's eyes. His unique, mismatched eyes, once called the Devil's Mark, became a source of affection in Willow Springs, with many commenting on how they seemed to reflect his special spirit. One warm evening in late August, Quentin invited Mabel for a walk after Elijah had been put to bed with Mrs. Sullivan happily agreeing to listen for him. They strolled to the edge of town, where the plains stretched out before them, painted gold by the setting sun. "I've been thinking," Quentin said as they stood watching the sunset, "about the future." Mabel's heart quickened. Over the months, their affection had deepened, expressed in small touches, long conversations, and a growing certainty that what they had found was rare and precious. "What about it?" she asked. Quentin turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I love you, Mabel Peterson. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength, and I love that boy of yours as if he were my own flesh and blood." Joy bubbled up within her. "We love you too, both of us." Quentin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring with a modest pearl set in silver. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right woman to give it to." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Mabel, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness sprang to Mabel's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Quentin, I will." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle and sweet, a promise of all that was to come. "There's something else," Quentin said as they walked back toward town, arm in arm. "I spoke with Judge Wilson yesterday, about Elijah." Mabel looked up at him curiously. "What about him?" "I asked about the legal process for adoption," Quentin explained. "I want to give him my name, Mabel. I want the world to know he's my son in every way that matters." Emotion overwhelmed her. This man, who had once been a stranger offering help on a desperate night, was now offering her son his name, his protection, his love. "Quentin," she managed through her tears, "nothing would make me happier." Their wedding took place in October, when the aspens in the surrounding mountains had turned to gold. The small church was filled with well-wishers, including Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, Dr. Wells, and many others who had welcomed Mabel to Willow Springs. Mrs. Sullivan held Elijah during the ceremony, the baby dressed in a new suit that Quentin had specially ordered from Denver. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin kissed Mabel tenderly, then turned to take Elijah in his arms. "Hello, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. As evening fell, Quentin led his new family to a small house at the edge of town, with a porch swing and a view of the mountains. "It's ours," he told Mabel, as she stood speechless. "I've been working on it whenever I could get away from the railroad. It's not much yet," but Mabel silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she whispered against his lips. That night, after Elijah was asleep in his new room, Quentin held Mabel close in their bed, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her arm. "I never thought I'd find this," he confessed in the darkness. "A home, a family. You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible." Mabel raised herself on one elbow to look at him. "You saved us that night, Quentin. You took in a desperate woman and a sick baby that the world had cast aside." Quentin shook his head. "You saved yourself, Mabel. You had the courage to leave, to seek help, to build a new life." His hand cupped her cheek. "I'm just grateful to be part of it." Their life together settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. Quentin continued his work with the railroad, earning promotions that allowed Mabel to leave her position at the bank when their daughter, Hope, was born a year after their wedding. Elijah grew into a sturdy, bright boy who adored his adoptive father and delighted in helping with his baby sister. The town expanded as the railroad brought new settlers, and Quentin's knowledge of the surrounding territory made him a valuable member of the community. When Willow Springs incorporated in 1880, he was elected to the town council, a position he accepted with characteristic humility. On Elijah's 5th birthday, they held a celebration in their garden, now lush with the plants and trees Mabel had lovingly tended. As the children played and neighbors chatted, Quentin found Mabel watching Elijah, who was showing his friends how to lasso a fence post, a skill Quentin had patiently taught him. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Yates," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. Mabel leaned into him, savoring his warmth. "I was just remembering that night, running through the darkness with him burning with fever in my arms, how certain I was that we would die alone out there." Quentin tightened his embrace. "I thank God every day that you found my campfire." "Do you remember what you said when you first held him?" Mabel asked, looking up at her husband. Quentin smiled, his eyes finding their son in the crowd of children. "I believe I said he was a fighter." "No, later," Mabel corrected gently. "When the townspeople had called him cursed and shunned us, you held him and said, 'He's my son now.'" Quentin's expression softened with the memory. "I meant it then, though I hardly knew what I was saying. Something in me just knew." Across the garden, Elijah successfully looped his small rope around the post. He turned, seeking out Quentin with a wide grin. "Papa, did you see? I did it." Quentin's face lit up with pride. "Well done, son, that's the way." As Elijah ran back to his friends, Mabel observed, "He has your smile now, and your determination." "But those eyes are all his own," Quentin replied. "Special, just like he is." Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Hope was asleep in her cradle, Quentin sat on Elijah's bed for their nightly ritual of stories. Mabel paused in the doorway, watching as her husband's deep voice spun tales of brave explorers and noble cowboys. Elijah's eyes grew heavy, but before he drifted off, he asked, "Papa, will you teach me to ride Scout tomorrow?" "Scout's getting old for riding lessons," Quentin replied gently. "But I've been thinking it might be time for you to have a pony of your own." Elijah's mismatched eyes widened with excitement. "Really? My very own? Really? A boy needs his own horse out here." Quentin ruffled Elijah's hair. "We'll start looking next week." "I love you, Papa," Elijah murmured, sleep beginning to claim him. "I love you too, son," Quentin replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." As they closed Elijah's door, Mabel slipped her hand into Quentin's. "You're a wonderful father," she said softly. Quentin pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And you, Mabel Yates, are the bravest woman I've ever known. Look at what you've built, what you've overcome." "What we've built," she corrected, rising on tiptoe to kiss him properly. "Together." That night, as moonlight filtered through their bedroom window, Mabel lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of her husband beside her, the occasional soft sounds from Hope's cradle in the corner, and the distant hooting of an owl. From desperate flight to profound love, from rejection to acceptance, from solitary struggle to family, her journey had been unexpected in every way. Yet here, in this house built with love, surrounded by the family they had forged together, Mabel knew she had found something more precious than she could have imagined on that frightening night when she had fled into the wilderness with her sick child. She had found home. Quentin stirred beside her, reaching for her even in sleep. Mabel nestled against him, comforted by his solid presence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys: Elijah's riding lessons, Hope's first attempts at crawling, the 100 small moments that made up their life together. But for now, in the quiet darkness, Mabel gave thanks for the twist of fate that had led her to a campfire in the wilderness, and to the man who had looked at her shunned, sick baby and declared, "He's my son now." Some would call it chance. Mabel called it destiny. As she drifted toward sleep, Mabel's last thoughts were of gratitude for the courage that had driven her forward that desperate night, for the campfire that had beckoned in the darkness, and most of all, for the man who had opened his heart to a woman and child in need, changing all their lives forever. In Quentin's arms, with their children sleeping safely nearby, Mabel Peterson Yates had found her place in the world, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to hope.